Welcome from the editorial board of BUP to a new expert talk within the topic of renovation of existing buildings. It is a pleasure to have with us Adrian Joyce as our expert today. Welcome, Adrian.
Delighted to be here, Julia.
I'm going to introduce him briefly. So Adrian is Secretary General of the European Alliance of Companies for Energy Efficiency in Buildings, EuroACE. He is also the campaign director of the Renovation Europe Campaign, which was initiated by EuroACE in 2011 in order to stop energy waste in buildings. Its ambition is to reduce the energy demand of the building stock in the EU by 80% by 2050 as compared to 2005. How have things changed in the 10-year lifespan of the Renovate Europe campaign? Where have stakeholders moved forward?
Well, Julia, that's a question that could take a long answer, because I'm delighted to say things have changed and moved along very nicely in the nearly 10 years that the Renovate Europe campaign has been in existence. At the outset, we were not getting a good hearing among policymakers, among decision takers, and the understanding and awareness about the importance of renovating existing buildings was very low. I would even go further. I would say that awareness was even low among many of the affected stakeholders themselves, because up to that point, a great deal of EU policy work had focused on new buildings and on the energy performance of those buildings. I feel that it was the Renovate Europe campaign that really changed that perception and really helped to put forward the notion that if we're serious about tackling some of the key climate challenges that we face, then buildings are the key sector to address. Among the stakeholder groups, we have seen over these 9 years a great deal more support being brought to our call and our cause. And that has been witnessed by the increasing number of partners that have signed up to be supporting or contributing to the success of the campaign. I'm absolutely delighted as director of the Renovate Europe campaign to say that although we started with just the 14 members of the EuroACE association, today we have 45 partners who are supporting our campaign from across civil society, across the construction value chain. And among those, we now count 17 national partners from 17 member states. So the evolution of the Renovate Europe campaign has been substantial. I guess a little later I can talk to you a bit about the real achievements and how our voice has helped to change the legislation and regulation at EU level, and about my hopes for action at national level.
So through Renovate Europe, you are pushing for an ambitious renovation wave. So what are your first reactions to this policy piece finally published in middle October?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a few days ago, because we're recording this on the 19th of October, we saw the publication of something that 5 years ago was probably unthinkable. That's how important this publication of the Renovation Wave strategy is, in my view, for European society. Our initial reaction to the content of the Renovation Wave strategy and the accompanying documents is positive. We see this as a step change in policy making for the building sector within the European Union. We see that the messages we've been broadcasting over the last 10 years have been heard, and it's very, very heartening for a man like me that has worked passionately on this topic for so long to see that at all levels of governance, from the very highest level of the presidents of the EU institutions right down to city administrations and local regions, we are seeing that the words around the need for ambitious renovation programs for buildings are being spoken by a very, very broad audience of stakeholders, politicians, and decision takers. So within the Renovation Wave strategy itself, the key aspect is that at EU level, we've now set a really good framework, and the challenge is now being put to the member states. And it is through the member state actions and how they can coordinate nationally within their national, in fact, there are three, it sounds complex, there are three areas where the member states really need to act. Firstly, in their national energy and climate plans, they must have a coherent policy for reaching a decarbonised economy by 2050. Among the plans they must have included are long-term renovation strategies. And those long-term renovation strategies are to date not working well enough for our ambition to be achieved. And the third element, due to the public health crisis caused by COVID-19, are the recovery and resilience plans that are being developed by the member states. We've been asking that the member states take up the challenge of addressing energy waste in buildings in those national recovery and resilience plans. And we are seeing that the European Commission has advised the member states to do so. So those plans, when they're written, and they're being written as we speak, they must, in our view, put buildings front and center. Otherwise, we are not going to achieve the long-term goals that Europe has set itself for climate neutrality in 2050. So in summary, a warm welcome, but realization that, if I might put it that way, we've now reached the end of the beginning, and the real work starts now down on the ground and within the markets across Europe.
Can you comment about the role that carbon revenues can or should play for the renovation sector at the European Union or at member states' national levels?
Yeah, carbon revenues are a very interesting topic because they are delivering to member states a very high amount of money, even today, where the price per ton is only set at around 25 euros. And with one of our partners, the Regulatory Assistance Project, we have been able, they have been able to calculate that in the next 10 years, up to, if I remember correctly, more than 100 billion euro can come on stream from carbon revenues for the use by member states. And that could be directed, of course, into energy renovation of buildings. In my opinion, this is one of the best revenue streams that member states could use because the revenue is kind of free revenue, if you like. What do I mean? It's revenue that's coming in addition to normal sources of revenue to member states. So in the Renovate Europe campaign, we have highlighted the fact that this revenue exists. And we have, just before the lockdown, in fact, held a special webinar. In fact, at the time, it was a physical meeting in the Czech permanent rep here in Brussels, because the Czech Republic have been using at first the Kyoto Protocol revenues and now the carbon revenues in order to successfully address energy waste in buildings. And they have treated thousands of multifamily homes within their territory in the period since, I'm trying to remember the year, but I think it was 1996 or 98 that they started. So, you know, around 20 years experience. So I see carbon revenues as a really important potential source for addressing energy waste in buildings and easing the financial burden on member states. If your question goes beyond that towards where future revenues might come from, we're very aware that there are conversations around looking at the use of fossil fuels for heating and cooling in buildings, and how maybe taxing those sources of energy might increase revenues towards renovation of buildings. Our emerging view, and it's not one that's within the Renovate Europe campaign fixed, is that if that policy develops in that direction, it must be done in a very careful manner, not to cause greater hardship, particularly among energy poor households or those buildings that are worst performing, because a new tax can be just or unjust. And in our view, this must be a just approach moving forward. And definitely, if such an approach is adopted, then the revenues from that should 100% go into energy renovation of buildings. and none of that is yet in the bag, as it were. It's all to be debated and discussed during 2021.
Now, considering some technical aspects of the renovation process, what are your views on listed heritage buildings, their role and potential for energy efficiency? Is it worth it or possible to consider deep renovation?
Heritage buildings, in my view, must be separated from historical buildings. So here's an important distinction I want to start with. So in the building stock in Europe, the vast majority of which were built before the year 2000, we have many different categories of buildings and many different ways of categorizing buildings. And in debates around deep energy renovation, there have often been confusions between what are called, in my view, heritage buildings and monuments and historical buildings. So I want to draw that distinction right at the start of this, answering this question. So when you think about it in that way, let's imagine every building before 2000 is an historical building because it's been around 20 years already. And within that package of buildings, there are very special buildings like chateaux, cathedrals, museum buildings that are really monuments. They're really anchors of cultural identity, anchors of community living, magnificent town halls, etc. And those heritage and monument buildings make up a small percentage of the building stock, maybe 1.5%. In my view, those buildings should be treated much more carefully than historical buildings because of their cultural, social value within our societies. So I would say that those buildings will only get a light touch. It doesn't mean it won't be a low level of savings. It could be a very significant level of savings, but they will have a light touch in terms of what we do to the fabric and to the equipment within the buildings. But when it comes then to the larger group of historical buildings, which are of, let's say, architectural merit, so maybe some beautiful terraces of houses or a beautiful square that's not a monument but an historical building, then I know that there are many European funded projects that have looked at how can you get significant energy savings in such buildings without detracting from their architectural merit and without detracting from their social importance within the community where they're located. And we have seen that it is possible to get very high levels of energy savings in many of those buildings. And it's maybe a good moment to mention that in 2019, the Renovate Europe campaign mounted a major exhibition inside the European Parliament where we displayed 29 projects from all across Europe, and among them several heritage projects which were considered heritage buildings of significant importance. One that comes immediately to mind is a villa in northern Italy, where the villa was fully renovated, and the savings achieved were in the order of 70%, 70, from before to after the works. And in fact, the appearance and the look of the building afterwards is better, but authentic to the works before the building. And in putting that exhibition up, we wanted to demonstrate that all building typologies across the EU can be addressed by energy renovation policies and programs, and that very successful examples exist right across the EU. I mean, another one comes to mind in Vienna, a beautiful Regency, so mid-19th century building that is beautifully renovated with about 65% energy savings. So my answer to your question really is, look, we have to understand the buildings, we have to understand their materiality, we have to know what can be achieved in a reasonably cost-effective manner, and then tailor the solutions to the buildings when we talk about heritage buildings or historical buildings. And in the Renovate Europe campaign, we've always been aware that there's a certain portion of the stock that we're not going to be able to treat moving forward. And we've always said that our ambition is to bring the energy demand of the building stock down by 80%, and not of each and every building. And that's a clear distinction we've always tried to make, because we're realistic. we know we're asking for an extremely challenging objective by 2050, and we want to be able to show how it can be achieved realistically in the market, because that's in all our interests, that it can actually be achieved, and that we don't call for something that then alienates a part of the stakeholder community. We don't want to alienate any stakeholder, because we need all stakeholders on board. I hope that answers your question, Julie.
Yeah, sure. Maybe going into more technical details. So still considering heritage buildings and also large parts of the European urban building stock. So we know that renovation with additional layers of external installation is not possible, and retrofitting with internal insulation is a more complex solution, and performance improvements may be harder to achieve. So can you explain to us what are the technical options today?
Yeah, there are many technical options. First of all, with heritage buildings and monuments, the first thing to do is to understand their usage pattern. What times of day, what times of year do they need to be in use? What precious objects do they contain? Then the areas where you can really work on the energy performance are to look at draft proofing and reducing losses through air infiltration or exfiltration, and then in introducing very good control systems for circulating the air, for capturing the warmth of the air before it's vitiated. So what you call in French, ventilation double flux, so heat recovery ventilation systems, and then better controls so that you're heating the building for the use that it's put to. In other words, you decide on what the parameters are for the structure and the rooms and the objects within them to remain in tip-top condition, and then you ensure that the right controls are in place for that through time. Where it's possible, and that's not always the case, there are very, very thin double glazed units that can be put in to replace existing glass. That's not always possible because sometimes the textures in the glass are part of the architectural character, but there are products that can be used. And so for me, when you ask me the question the way you put it, these are the things I would be looking at first. So to reduce or control losses through the fabric. And indeed, as you point out, you can't cover either the internal walls or the external walls with insulation in most of these cases. But in most cases, just thinking of the insulation, you can insulate in the attic space. You can often insulate under the floors. So you can improve the thermal performance as well as the indoor air environment by draft proofing and better controls, as I've just spoken about. So these are the strategies that for me would come to mind. But for those who are interested in going further, there's a great EU project called 3 and Cult that could be looked at, where they looked in much more detail at this. We were not a partner, but I'm aware of that as a really groundbreaking EU-funded project for this concern.
And how do you assess the potential of prefabricated renovation kits? Must these be generalized where applicable?
I assess the use of industrialized renovation as a very important step moving forward. It's something that is grossly undervalued at the present time, because when we look at how digitalization has begun to affect the construction sector, we now see that we have industrial facilities that can undertake what we call mass customization. So panels can be built with a performance level that are each to a very slightly different dimension. So when they come to the building, they fit the buildings perfectly. This industrialized approach is, in my view, really a very important one that we must look more seriously at in the coming months and years. To go a little further, the industrialized approach that's best known, at least within European circles, is a Dutch approach called Energiesprong, which is now rolling out in France and the United Kingdom. But there are other approaches that are available for off-site prefabrication of energy renovation elements. And there's a large number of EU-funded projects that have looked at this question. They don't come to mind right away, but at least 4 or 5 recently funded projects have addressed this question of prefabrication of elements that then go together for buildings. But what are the other important aspects about industrialization that don't get spoken about so much? One of the first is that it makes working in the construction sector more attractive and easier for a broader range of society. So younger people, women, can come into our sector and contribute to the renovation wave. The digitalization side needs a great deal of people who understand ICT, information communication technologies, in their DNA, if you like, not my generation, rather the younger generations. And by industrialization, we can bring a great deal of the work indoors. We can improve the safety, the quality, and the circularity of the materials used, reduce waste streams, and then they're all big advantages for attracting a wider workforce into construction. And then with industrialized approaches, you can on the site, so outdoors, reduce the time of the interventional site. In the Energiesprong approach that I spoke about earlier, they on average will renovate four houses in 5 days in a real situation. Yes, they have to be out at the site to do some preparatory works for 1 or 2 days before those programmed 5 days, but 4 buildings in 5 days to go from a building wasting energy to a building with a 0 energy bill. Now that's the kind of approach we need to see being broadcast more. And lately I've come across another approach that I'm quite interested in called Whiskers. It was also an EU-funded project, but back in the 90s, I think, or maybe the early 2000s, which industrializes the cutting of insulation boards and plaster boards for interior insulation in buildings. And in that case, you end up with no waste, no dust, very little disruption on site, and you can do the internal wall insulation in a 3-bedroom apartment in 2 to 3 days. And that is another technology that's not so well known that I have recently learned about, that I feel could have a very big benefit. One of the last benefits on industrialization that I'd like to talk about is the terrible impacts of the COVID crisis causing a lot of unemployment in the tourism and the hospitality sectors. And in a technology approach like Whiskers, the technical skills needed for internal wall insulation are of a lower level than those that are needed for example, the Energiesprong approach. So retraining hospitality and tourism workers into our sector to undertake projects in that area could be a really great tactic for many member states to roll out in the recovery period about to come. And only this morning I learned, for example, in my own country in Ireland, that there's a new program called apprenticeship.ie, where the government is supporting apprenticeships into many different sectors for those who wish to change their career or who wish to upskill or to switch from one sector to another. So many promising initiatives to come, and we await with interest the Skills Pact, which has been announced by the European Commission, and that will see new programs coming out in the member states in the months and years ahead.
Finally, one last question. Can you comment on the importance of having clear and harmonized minimum energy performance standards?
Yeah, another pillar of what we've been calling for moving forward. We believe that minimum energy performance standards for all renovations are crucially important. Why do we say that? for a number of reasons. Number one, in observing the construction sector for already decades in my case, I have never seen a significant shift in practice or in the approaches undertaken by the construction value chain unless it was regulated. So it's really responsive to regulation and not so responsive to other forms of incentives. Secondly, when you think that residential buildings undergo a significant renovation on a cycle about once every 25 to 30 years, and most commercial buildings undergo a renovation every 15 to 20 years, at best we have 1.5 renovation cycles between now and 2050, when we have to come to a point where the entire building stock is highly energy efficient and decarbonized. If we don't, therefore, put into place targets and milestones that begin to push us into that pathway that will lead to highly energy efficient and decarbonized buildings, we're going to fail. I mean, it's as simple as that. And when we think about what are the instruments that could be used, we see minimum energy performance standards as the most powerful for this circumstance. Now, we don't see it, and I think that's very important to say to the audience, we don't see it as a blunt instrument that comes in from one day to the next and suddenly there's a transformed approach to energy renovation. No, we see it as something that should be signaled over a period of time and then gradually tightened over time. And we can compare it to the introduction of nearly zero energy building standards for new buildings, which were announced in the 2010 revision of the Buildings Directive, but only come into force fully on the 1st of January of next year, 2021. So there's been a 10-year period for industry, for society, for contractors to learn how to build nearly zero energy buildings. And when it comes to minimum energy performance requirements for renovation, we think a similar phasing is a very good idea. So a declaration, for example, that by 2025, all rental properties in the commercial sector should be an energy performance label of C or B or whatever the country would choose, and then to allow the market to adjust across the 5-year period to that deadline. But then, of course, we think that the standards ought to then be accompanied by good monitoring and evaluation to be sure that we can do it as we go along, and penalties if you don't achieve those requirements in time. And if this sounds radical to some of those listening, let me just say that this exists already in many of the EU member states. And possibly the most well-known example is in the Netherlands, where by 2023, and that was announced already 2 or 3 years ago, all office buildings must be energy performance level C or better, or they cannot be rented on the market. And in the Netherlands as well, the social housing sector has voluntarily committed to make all of their properties an average of A by the end of this year, and they're going to achieve it. So it is possible to do it, but we believe it should be carefully considered and it should be stringent, but the market should be given the time to adapt. And the last point on this is when we come down to deciding when such a requirement should be applied to a building, we think in the commercial and tertiary sector, it can be a bit like I've just described for the Netherlands. But in the residential private property section, then maybe it's better to consider tying it to key moments in the life of the building, such as change of ownership. So that at the point of change of ownership, there is an important requirement to deep renovate. Or, and then you could have an option that or in by a certain date in the future, 2035 maybe, or 2030, all residential properties must be at a certain energy level. And then for those that don't have the means to do it, I mean, financially, then there should be grant programs and preferential loan programs available, which was a very big part of our calls ahead of the renovation wave, that financing for the renovation wave is crucially important for success, but that the financing has got to be tailored in such a way that it can be taken up by all segments of society in an equitable way. It means that those in worst performing buildings or energy poverty get grant aided, no repayments needed, but those that can afford it are given preferential loans that can afford to repay over, say, a 15-year period, but only granted if the performance levels are achieved. So we've been very careful, I hope, in the way we've asked for EU and member state support for renovation moving forward, because of our conviction that unless we deep energy renovate all of our buildings to the right standard and quality, then we're not going to achieve our long-term goals, not even our medium-term goals moving forward.
Thank you, Adrian, for sharing with us your point of view and some insights regarding the topic of renovation of existing buildings. And thank you also to our audience.
Thank you, Julia, for the questions. It's great chatting with you.